Hello everyone, it's good to see you again. Wingodam, Anamyolan, Yodalik, in this place. I was here a couple weeks ago with my friend Pete, and there was a lot of people here that day, and it's good to see the turnout. One of them, Hulipayon, them Nitzia, David Brule, Nidomba. I'm happy to welcome my brother and my friend David Brule tonight.
Cousins,
literally we are related. Right. If you're from Canada, you're related. pretty small geno pool there at the very, very beginning, and my ancestors go way back, as do his. And some of those ancestors from the old country met some of the folks who were already here. And folks of this place, the Abenaki, the Sokoki people, they're related rather closely to the folks further north on the St. Lawrence, the Wabanaki. So without further ado, or whoever's next, you're going to like this.
Really spoke of the gene pool, I gotta tell you. Our family's been going into our ancestry. We're French and Cherokee and Abenaki and a few other things. And I'm finding out that the gene pool is starting to bring in a lot of my friends that I've known for years, and I'm scratching my head saying, Graveline, Graveline. My wife and I realized that we both have Graveline in our family, and so we're going to have to figure that one out. But our daughter seemed to have turned out quite well. My name is Joe Graveline. I am one of the founding members and past president of the Nolambika Project, and a longtime member of the Northfield Historical Commission. And David's going to talk about just how incredibly unique this gathering of people that have been doing this study for over a decade is. And there are historical commissions from a number of towns that David will talk about, but the Northfield Historical Commission has been on this project and with me as the representative since day one. The body of work that's been created is absolutely mind-blowing. It would take somebody 6 months to read their way through it, I judge. And it's been an exciting adventure. My job actually tonight is to introduce David Brule, and I found a wonderful piece of writing in this beautiful pictorial that introduces David, so I will read it to you. David Brule, who was born and raised in Montague, Massachusetts, is of Niantic, Narragansett, Huron, and Wendat descent. He's the president of the Nolambika Project. Took my job away from me. And he's done a great job. Whose mission is in part to promote a deeper, broader, and more accurate description of the history of Native Americans, American Indians of the Northeast before and during European contact and colonialization. And a little bit about the Nolambika Project real quick. The organization works to preserve ancient indigenous sites in the Connecticut River Valley, offers educational programs, and serves as a bridge between cultures and between past and future generations. And I've just seen that unfold over and over again. He now lives on Pecumtuck homeland in his great-grandfather's house in Millers Falls, Massachusetts. And there's a story there that's wonderful too, but I don't think we have time tonight to just capture how much magic has been occurring in this valley for over 9,000 years. And for the research that we've been doing, we have learned to gain so much respect for each other. This unique group of people that have come together. We've lost 2 of our members who have passed on. David may speak to that at some point. But Kwekwe, hello, and without further ado, I would like to introduce David Brule.
Saturday afternoon, going on Saturday evening, and it's a chilly day, but it's fantastic to see people here, so many people. Before I start, I do want to mention a thing or two about remembering that we are standing on and benefiting from indigenous homelands. Our homes, our schools, our businesses, churches are built upon land that has been indigenous land since the last glacier retreated more than 13,000 years ago. Those first peoples are not gone. Their voices are still here in the air that we breathe. Their descendants are here among us now. Those descendants have become more diverse as new blended families blossom from historic ones. These families are part of the fabric of the valley and especially of Northfield, and I really am thankful that the 350th committee and people like Don Campbell have been making a huge effort to make sure that the indigenous people are part of the community fabric. It's very important. We offer thanks to our relatives and ancestors gathered together here today and across time. So I'm going to get started, and I hope you don't mind me standing down here. As a classroom teacher, I tend to move around a lot, and I was going to be feel a little confined up there in the pulpit. Plus, I wouldn't be able to see the screen so well, so that would have made a kind of a complicated situation for me. So basically what I want to do is, as you can see from my title page, The War in Your Backyard. Basically what went on here in the valley and what happened here in Northfield. So the job I've been doing along with the Nolan Beaker Project and Joe Gravelin and others, Rich Holshoe, is working on recovering indigenous voices, but also looking into the deeper history of the earliest encounters between the white settlers and the indigenous people who had been here for the last 10,000 years. So a couple of events that I'm expecting to share with you. First of all, in fairly broad brush strokes. I mean, in the next hour, I can't really dig deep and drill down into all of the stories that are in our landscape and in our history pages. I do hope that, I know that there are a lot of people here who have spent a lot of time either studying it or remembering the stories or reading up on what happened in the valley and what happened in Northfield in particular. So again, when I do my broad sketch of some of these incidents, like the Beers ambush and like Mary Rowlandson's presence here in Northfield, that you'll forgive me if I don't go really deep. But I do want to get a lot in. My third part is going to be about what people like Joe and myself and Rich and a number of indigenous tribal historic preservation officers have been doing for the last 10 years in studying the events of King Philip's War. So those are going to be kind of my primary parts. So what I want to do at the beginning is to talk a little bit about the context of King Philip's War. It's not a talk today about King Philip's War, but we need to know what the context was. It was called at one point America's Unforgotten War. Forgotten War. And for a lot of, I would say a lot of decades and generations, it was kind of overlooked, although as you will see in a little bit, it was one of the most significant wars that, even though the country was not yet founded, one of the more significant and devastating wars in our common history. So let's see, Misha, can you? So one of the context here is, if you can all picture 1620, when the Pilgrims showed up what most of them stated was the fact that there was no one around, and other people had also observed that there were human remains, bones lying on the surface of the earth unburied, and that was due to rolling waves of epidemics. So it's been estimated that there were probably about 100,000 natives in the Northeast, at the end of the 1500s. And by the time the Pilgrims showed up and the Puritans started landing in Massachusetts Bay Colony, about 80%, and that's a low estimate, about 80% of that population had died from epidemics. So that set the stage in some ways for a real challenge for Native people, because they didn't have the soldiers to defend their way of life. They didn't have the wherewithal to be able to organize against what was becoming an encroachment on their homelands. So a case in point is this list of towns. If you check it out, you see representatively, you see that about every year there was a new town. There's a new town being set, like leapfrogging either up the valley. Primarily, the settlements came up the valley as opposed to coming from the east coast. But check it out. So you've got Springfield, 1636, Lancaster, 1643, Longmeadow, 1644, Medfield, 49, 52, Northampton in 1654, Hadley, 1659, skip over to Westfield, 1660, Hatfield, 1661, down to Brookfield, 1664. So you can read this. It'll be sitting up here for a little bit, so you get a chance to check it out. But you can imagine what that felt like for the native populations, seeing their homelands being cleared and settled, and all these populations of white settlers moving in. In general, we could say that if you can, the way I explained it anyway, if you can picture a small band of pilgrims showing up in Plymouth, being welcomed by Massasoit, and helped through the winters, and then 10 years later a band of Puritans showed up in Massachusetts Bay Colony. By the time you went from the generation of Massasoit in 1620 to the generation of Metacomet or King Philip, there was a population explosion of English of about 76,000 as a conservative estimate. And as the English population, Puritan population was going up, then the native population, due to the epidemics especially, was dropping. So you had a kind of a context where native people were, if they're paying attention, were really getting alarmed. And so Metacomet, Philip kind of came to the fore through a whole series of circumstances, one being that his brother, dubbed Alexander on Seta, mysteriously died after having visited a home in Plymouth, I believe. And so that, with the brother's death, then that pushed Philip into being the main leader of, at least, of the Wampanoag, the Pokanoket at the time. So you can see all of these, the way all of these towns evolved and how quickly they were settled. Right at the end, we've got Deerfield, 1673, and Northfield, 1673 also. So then, bang, 1675, there was the flash happened down in Swansea. There was a lot of tension. Before long, there was the powder keg went off and the war was launched. And Philip found himself in a tight spot. We can get into that, but it's not all about Philip. It's going to be more like what flowed from there. Check out the lower part. By the end of 1676, 52 towns in New England, many of these had been attacked and 23 were pillaged and 17 were destroyed. So that's a huge number for a small native population. very effective strategies and very effective ways of carrying out their warfare. Some of the towns that were attacked and some destroyed: Brookfield, Hadley, Hatfield, Springfield. Springfield was burned to the ground. Lancaster, that will figure in a couple of minutes in one of the stories. Northampton was attacked, was not overtaken, but it was attacked, and Captain Turner happened to be in the fortified part of Northampton at the time, so he managed to repulse some of the attack. Medfield, Attleboro, Seekonk, Providence. Providence was burned to the ground. Roger Williams was very upset about that, but he couldn't stop it. Scituate, Bridgewater, Groton, Marlborough, Sudbury, Taunton, Chelmsford, Northfield, and Deerfield. So those were some of the names of the towns, and there were others, but those are the ones that I chose to put up here. So that's the context I'm trying to share with you. The epidemics, the overwhelming population explosion, the great migration out of England, just really set the native people back on their heels. And then I think historians like Peter or others like myself, we kind of hesitate to call it a culture class because that's kind of like an easy way to describe it. It was much more than just a clash of cultures. There was a tremendous amount of other contextual strife going on. So, Misha, to underline the impact of King Philip's War on this, on the United Colonies. So most scholars agree that King Philip's War was the deadliest in American history based on English and native casualties relative to the populations there. So if you're really good at math, you can sort this chart out, but you can see in comparative figures. So the King Philip's War, the estimated deaths were 800 out of a population of 52,000, which put it at about, in proportion to its population, is about 1,538, whereas 3,000 deaths and out of a population of 20,000. So that was really huge. If the proportion, you check that out, you can see 15,000 equivalent. That devastated the native populations here. We'll talk about the diaspora that flowed from that in a bit. So let me know if I wander too far away from my microphone. The French genes kick in once in a while. I move around a lot more and I talk with my hands, and so I'm training myself to stay close to the microphone, but if not, just give a shout. Even if you're not concerned or not noticing the deaths relative to the population, it's just stunning to see. In the Civil War, 305,235 Americans died in that particular war out of a population of 35,630,000. So the white population was growing at just a fascinating rate. World War II, 291,557 casualties, and out of a population of 141 million. So you know our population these days is around 360 million, if not more. So just a population growth astounding over the generations. The sources: Department of Defense, Bureau of Census, and estimates by a great historian called Francis Jennings. And then this is a quote from Eric Schultz and Micah Tugias, who wrote what I call a field guide to King Philip's War. If you haven't seen this book and you're interested, you should really check it out, because it covers all of the various theaters of the war and the incidents, some of which I'll talk about today, but it tells you how to get there, what to look for, where the markers are, and what was the history behind it. It's a fantastic field guide. If you know about field guides to the birds and field guides to the plants, well, this is a field guide to King Philip's War. Measured against the European population, New England, the death rate was nearly twice that of the Civil War and more than 7 times that of World War II. So it was a pretty devastating war based on population. Okay. So I apologize for the smallness of the print. I'll read it, but that's something I have to work on. Who was involved? The United Colonies of Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Rhode Island. So that says they were united colonies, but they weren't that united because there were a number of separate jealousies and separate territoriality efforts that kind of put them at odds from time to time, and it certainly played out at the massacre that occurred in Turner's Falls at Peskionskut, when one faction thought they were negotiating with the Connecticut colonies, and in the meantime the Massachusetts Bay Colony had another set of peace negotiations going on, and so that led to a lot of confusion among the native people, but I'll get to that in a bit. Who were the tribes? The major tribes involved are the Pokanoket and the Pocasset Wampanoag. So the Wampanoag are down in this vicinity here, okay, right here, where they still are. They have a sizable population, they're still there. There's a population also on Martha's Vineyard. Both of these are federally recognized tribes, the Mashpee and the Quina Wampanoag. The Nipmuc and related Quabog, Nashaway. So the Nipmuc people are still here. Their territory is quite reduced, of course, but at one point their homeland stretched from just outside of Boston all the way right here to the Falls, and from the Connecticut, modern-day Connecticut border up to the New Hampshire-Vermont border. So that was a huge, huge population of people. One of the anecdotes that I found interesting is that when Philip took over, of course, his father being Massasoit, well, Massasoit retired from being a chief, and he headed out to Mount Wachusett because that's where his mother was from. His mother was a Nipmuc. And so the tribal leadership all across the Northeast was integrated, intermarried, and that kind of generally kept the peace among all the different communities of native people. But Massasoit had headed out here for his retirement days. And so when Philip managed to escape from the English in the vicinity of his homeland around Mount Hope, in this vicinity, he headed up to Mount Wachusett. And once he got into Nipmuc country, he was really in a pretty good situation to carry on the war. The Narragansett, fascinating group. They are still here, very powerful tribe, and certainly at the time of King Philip's War, they had the largest army of all the tribes around here. And they got drawn into the war kind of, I wouldn't say reluctantly, but belatedly, because some of the Wampanoag refugees fleeing the English were taken in by the Narragansetts, and then the Narragansetts had a fort deep in a great swamp, and the English insisted that they turn over the Wampanoag, who were officially at war with the Brits, and they refused. The Narragansetts refused, to their credit. There's a celebrated saying, which I don't know if it's actually so many of these quotes, sometimes you wonder, but the leader of the Narragansetts said, "You won't get one single paring of a fingernail of a Wampanoag from us. They are our cousins and brothers, and they're here. We're going to take care of them." So the English somehow decided that they were going to attack that fort. There was a huge massacre, again, and a number of the Narragansett got away, but many more were burned alive, killed. And so that, of course, drew the Narragansetts in. So now you have a coalition of the Nipmuc, the Narragansett, and the Wampanoag, which is a pretty powerful group to be dealing with. In the mid-Connecticut River Valley, you have the My light is gone, perhaps. Yeah. Well, you can see, I'll try this. It's the mid-Connecticut River Valley. You have Pocumtuck, the tribe that whose central homeland and main place is in what we now call Deerfield, but whose kinship ties and alliances with any number of other tribes in the valley made them one of the most powerful tribes in the Northeast. The Pocumtuck, the Nonotuck, Noawatuk, Agawam, Orinoco, and the Sokoke, the Abenaki that were in this part of their southernmost reach of the Abenaki tribes. So they are still here. Unfortunately, the Pocumtuck have, at the end of King Philip's War, the diaspora was such that they headed up to the St. Lawrence River French missions. Some went to the Mohican Stockbridge Munsee people and off further into the west. Others blended in with the Nipmuc. They kind of got their revenge when they came back in 1704 and raided Deerfield. So, you know, what you will pick up from this, I hope, this talk, if you haven't thought about it already, is the fluidity of the movement of these tribes. People circulated and came back. I always think when Joe and I were talking about French Canadians, and, you know, it's quite likely that the Pocumtuck descendants wound up back at their homelands in what's now called Turner's Falls and Deerfield, basically because they integrated into the Abenaki tribes, and Abenaki intermarried with French Canadians, and French Canadians showed up back in Turner's Falls to work in the mills. So I like to think that their genes are still around somewhere. It's really good. But that gives you a kind of an illustration of the movement of tribal peoples all through the Northeast, and certainly modern-day Deerfield back then was a central place where Native people always came back to seasonally or for peace conferences or whatever else, for cultural purposes, spiritual purposes. So that gives you a kind of it's going to be hard to remember all this, but some of you are very familiar with these terms. But the point I want to make is obviously that people in the central Connecticut River Valley were very much involved in the war. Misha? So, one of the bookends of the King Philip's War involved Captain Richard Beers. Very unfortunate occurrence happened, and I think those of you from Northfield are quite familiar with this map. I mean, you can see Route 63 coming up from let's say, the modern town of Irving, and going up to town here. So you'll see these signs along the road concerning the Beers ambush and et cetera. So basically, when you think about what led up to this, the conflagration happening on the coast, that was happening on the coast. So the Connecticut River Valley was relatively, if the Swansea attack with Philip and his escape from Mount Hope was in the early summer, June, July, nothing had happened in the valley up until then. Then, just a little bit outside of our Happy Valley here, there was an incident in Brookfield called Wheeler's Surprise, and you would have thought that an officer would have, by the third one of these ambushes and surprise, would have figured out that this was not the way to do things. So right around, on August 1st, there was a surprise ambush of colonials who were just marching right on through, right outside of Brookfield, and they were ambushed by hundreds of Nipmuc, mostly led, I believe, by a warrior sachem called Monaco. So Wheeler's surprise happened on August 1st. That's still technically outside of the valley. So then, the next incident before we got to the unfortunate Captain Beers took place outside of Northampton on August 24th and 5th, which basically was the first incident that really involved an unarmed conflict here in the valley. And that was, again, an issue where the, I believe it was Massachusetts Bay Colony, determined that given all the action that was going on the coast, and Wheeler had just been surprised, that they needed to disarm the local Norwottucks. Had a fort just outside of Northampton, up north of Northampton. So they felt, well, they were supposedly friendly Indians, but they didn't want to take any chances, so they were going to claim the weapons. Of course, that's a disaster for native hunters. If you don't have, I mean, sure, you could be skilled with bows and arrows, but a flintlock was way more effective. And so for a family, losing their flintlocks would have been a real hardship. So, but the English were determined to disarm the Norwottucks, and the Norwottucks got wind of that and headed north ahead of the 100 troopers from Northampton. And I find this curious that they got ambushed, second time now, in Hopewell Swamp. So, unless I'm mistaken, way back when the glacial lake Hitchcock drained, the first Paleo Indians moving into the region set up a hunting camp right near Mount Sugarloaf, Wequamps, in this valley, swale where the caribou would be coming down, and they knew that they could hunt caribou at this choke point. So lo and behold, the Norwottucks set up 10,000 years later in the same choke point and waited for the English to come walking on through. And you know, it was about 9 to 10 English lost their lives. The native people were basically the men, the warriors, would have, in typical indigenous fashion, would have sent the women, children, and the elderly on ahead, and certain designated warriors would stay behind. And they ambushed, what do you know, Beers and Lathrop, who turned up in our history very shortly thereafter, within weeks of walking into the same kind of ambush. So that was the first incident, August 25th, of the conflagration hitting the Connecticut River Valley and right down here in Whately, right below Mount Sugarloaf. So there was a tiny little settlement right up here. Probably Joe would tell us better as to where exactly the first settlement was, probably down towards the main part of town. And what Sheldon tells us is that there was a fortified, there was a palisade, about 17 cabins or living spaces, a church, and a fort. And around September 2nd, the combined groups of the Sokoke, Abenaki, and the Nipmuc attacked Northfield and killed about 8 people. It was a kind of unexpected. They hadn't heard about Wheeler's surprise, and they hadn't heard about Hopewell Swamp and Beers getting attacked down there. So Massachusetts Bay got word that the people, the settlers here in Northfield, were under siege, and so they sent word to Hadley to have someone come up and relieve the settlers here. So that fell to Captain Richard Beers. He headed out with about 38 to 39 dragoons, meaning soldiers who were riding horseback. They're not cavalry, but they get from one place to the other on horseback. So they headed up from Hadley. It probably was a 30-mile trek, I think, what I've heard. And they couldn't quite get to the settlement before dark, so they camped out down here near 4 Mile Brook. And the next day, Beers and most of his men headed out. 13 stayed behind with supplies in the wagons and whatever. And so again, in typical British fashion, they just walked up the main path to Northfield. And of course, natives, and this played out again and again, and we were able to really document it in the study that we're going to talk about at the Battle of Peschiomska and the massacre in May of 1676. So they headed up the main path, which I'm told, at least in this field guide to the King Philip's War that I mentioned by Tugius and Schultz, that you can see Route 63 is that heavy dark line. Apparently the path to here, to Northfield, was a little bit to the east of that, the original track to get up to Northfield. So Captain Beers and his men headed up, and I'll have to leave my site here. My little light's not working. So the battery's shot, I guess. So you can see a little bit up and to the right is a brook called Roaring Brook. I don't know if that's still the same name. Those of you who live here will know that. Okay, so right around Roaring Brook, Beers and his men walked right into a little interval, and it was ambushed. It was a horrific ambush. A lot of men were killed. They retired from, they withdrew from there and headed back down towards what became known as Beers Hill, where apparently that's where Beers was killed. The history told by the survivors was that Beers valiantly defended himself and made sure that he took enemies with him. Who knows? It's probably true, but there's no way of verifying that. He was killed and left, I believe. He might have been hurriedly buried, but eventually he was killed at the foot of this place here, and then quite possibly his men or the next relief mission that came up buried him right near the school, the Linden Hill School there. So the tradition in Northfield is that was where Beers was buried. In the meantime, the Tugius and Schultz mentioned the old soldier's hole, meaning that there was one of the survivors who covered himself with leaves, hid in a hollow for several days, and then when he thought it was safe to head out, and he started back down what was basically now Route 63. If you know where the French King Motel is, then he would have crossed that solar field that's up there now. I have a story about that. And he crossed Route 2, went down to the mouth of the Miller's River, which was the main ford, because there being no first light power dam, the water was a lot shallower, and people could get across there. Going up, if you know your geography, going up East Mineral Road, coming up to approximately Lake Pleasant and the country road that heads south to Sunderland. And I always wondered if, I imagine that great big old sycamore tree was growing at the time. So that beautiful sycamore in Sunderland, they must have gone by there at some point. So anyway, that was basically the route they came up. And his men who panicked, they shot and ran all the way down and got all the way back home. Some took days, others made it back in a much shorter time. So that meant that the settlers were still stuck up here. So the order came that a major treat would be sent up from the Connecticut colonies to rescue the settlers. So he headed out with 100 men this time and came up the same way I was telling you, up through Lake Pleasant and past Sunderland and Lake Pleasant, down East Mineral Road, across the Millers River, whose native name, by the way, is the Pagwag. So I don't know where, I live on that river and I don't know where the term came from and when it got to be used, but a lot of the earlier histories call it the Pagwag. So they went up across through Prondecki solar field, came out to approximately where Route 63 is now and headed up to Northfield. And of course, you probably know the legend, and the story is that they found, on the way up, they found men's heads on poles and people hanging from trees, basically obviously to freak them out, to scare them. And a lot of bodies had stayed unburied. So they got the settlers out, they decided to leave everything behind and started back. I think that they were not able at a certain point till much later to actually bury people. Sheldon wrote about a woman he interviewed whose, 3 times great-grandfather was a person who was killed in that ambush and was the first person buried in the Northfield Cemetery.
Samuel Wright.
Pardon?
Samuel Wright.
Wright, yes, W-R-I-G-H-T. I just want to quote Sheldon. So on the trip back, Treat coming back with the survivors, and Sheldon, he was writing history like they don't write history too much these days. But he said, "We are left to imagine the long cavalcade, a line of strange, black-looking specters, threading its way the livelong night through the gloomy woods, and the panic-stricken riders peering fearfully right and left into the thickets, or crowding together in terror at the hoot of an owl or bark of a fox or a wolf, sure that each was a war whoop of a pursuing foe." So that's pretty good reading, and writing rather. So that's how he described going back down. One of the things that maybe somebody here like Peter Thomas or others could mention is that Sheldon said that Treat came up and he brought with him another 100 Mohegans and Pequots. And that was not unknown that the Mohegans and the Pequots sided with the English, in spite of the Pequots being wiped out in a massacre in Mystic, Connecticut, modern-day Connecticut. But I think that was a little early for indigenous people to join in.
They were in it from the beginning. The reason the Pequots is Uncas absorbed the remainder of the Pequots.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the Mohegans and the Pequots. Where Connecticut had a whole different approach to native allies, and Uncas had allied himself with Connecticut well before the war. So they did come up with about 60 of them came.
Okay, because I do know that certainly on the coast where other Indian fighters, killers like Benjamin Church, he didn't catch on to using indigenous scouts for much later. So when I heard that 100 Mohegans, I knew Uncas and the Mohegans and the English were pretty tight. Uncas was a very cagey guy. And the Pequots, of course, had suffered greatly in an unbelievable massacre. But the Pequots who survived were kind of split up among tribes. Some went to the Narragansetts, some stayed with the Mohegans, some went over to the Nahantics, some went into English homes, some went as adoptees, and others went as servants or slaves. So, but they were not annihilated to the extent that they became extinct. They remained strong, and their descendants now run a Fox Casino down there. So, you hang around long enough, you never know. So anyway, that's the Beers attack, and a lot of you, I was talking with a gentleman a couple of weeks ago up here when Peter Thomas was giving his talk, and he quoted the fact that he lived on Beers Lane Road here. So all of that, I hope, those of you who live in Northfield, that you know about this. And like I said, I can't drill down because of the time, it's so deep into some of these things, but you should check it out. And I'm sure there's a lot of local lore that still has to be integrated into some of the stories. So, Misha? This is what we call at the Battlefield Advisory Board that I'm going to talk about in about 10 minutes, what we call a mystery. Because you may be familiar with this, I'm sure you have seen it 100 times. What we at the Battlefield study have been trying to sort out is, where were these calcifiers and who was there? And how do we find it? And what role did it play in the closure of King Philip's War? So it's just a mystery. We haven't, Peter has helped us with trying to sort out some of this. The curiosity is that this sign, they're all over Massachusetts for the tercentenary recognition. They're all pretty much, what would you call it, antiquarian signs that leave very little room for any of the indigenous inhabitants, of course, because they were technically conquered, vanished, erased, whatever you want to call it, by 1920. And so this particular sign says there were Indian council fires not far from the sign. And it also, by the way, was not far from where Beers died. So we wanted to know about the council fires, especially some of the indigenous people on our board, because they felt that the council fires were an indication of all of these tribes getting together to figure out what to do a planning session. Are we going to continue to fight? Are we going to try to deal with peace with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Connecticut colonies, and all that? So we want our archaeologists to go look at this, but the problem is, and I'll explain it later on, is that we got funding from the Park Service, and they're interested in musket balls and metallic objects left from that particular war. And we can't really be sure that there were shots fired at the council fires, so that wouldn't really quite qualify. So we've been pushing very hard to say, well, this is an auxiliary site. This clearly involved planning and strategies. And the other part of the mystery, first of all, where are the council fires? As you all know, there's a beautiful boardwalk there called Alderman Swamp Road Path. Right next to it, there's a kind of a junkyard in the back where there may well have been the site of the council fires. We just don't know. One of the other mysteries is that this is George Sheldon. He says, on the territory of Squawkee were gathered the great body of hostile Indians at a low estimate of 3,000. So he's placing 3,000 Indians up here in Northfield. And we know that that population was pretty close to being true, because after the Great Swamp Massacre in December of 1675, the Narragansetts headed up here, as did a lot of the coastal tribes, the Wampanoags. And they were seeking refuge up in this area, which was always an area of sanctuary for Native people. So Philip was up here with 3,000 combatants, non-combatants. And Sheldon actually told us who was here. It's like a who's who of all of the tribal leaders during this war. So it's good to see their names. The mystery is we don't know how he got those names. We've looked into it. Apparently the writer, I'll say that in quotes, of the content of these signs was one Samuel Eliot Morrison, who was top dog in New England history writers, historians, but he probably wasn't responsible for the narrative. He's kind of a figurehead of just getting all the signs ready and making sure that it said what they were supposed to say, but he probably didn't write it. So we tried to find out on the board. Apparently he was a professor at one point at Harvard, so people thought they'd go to Harvard and look to see if his records were there, because we wanted to know, where did he get this information? Joe did a lot of digging up here in the Northfield records and histories written about Northfield. One of the side stories was that they checked out the library at Harvard, our people who had the time to go to Harvard to look for this stuff, and they said, oh, well, those materials are in the hands of Samuel Eliot Morrison's great-grandniece, and she's got them somewhere, I guess, in the vicinity of Boston, and in a box somewhere. And so when people attempted to track that down, it was stated, they were told, well, it's not organized, it's just big chock-a-block bunch of records in there. So it wound up being a dead end, and I'm not sure that Samuel Morrison actually did the research himself anyway. So, but check this out, this is the who's who present at Northfield here. Among the 3,000 souls was Philip Anawan, his first general. There was Awashanks, who was a woman warrior, sachem, which was not a rare thing. So Awashanks. Witamu is, we'll talk about her in a little bit, but she's a legendary warrior Sunk Squaw leader. Had all these people here. Kanonchet, who was the major general of the Narragansetts. So he was here. They're all apparently trying to figure out what to do. Nekopik, we'll meet these people later on. Quinnipiac, Stonewall John, Tatasun, all these other names that should be remembered, should be just as commonly known as some William Turner or Captain Holyoke. So part of our project is to get these names back into circulation so people know. Peter Thomas has done I asked Peter for the names of a couple of natives that would have been on deeds in the Deerfield area, and he sent me a spreadsheet that was like this long with all of these names that were basically unpronounceable, but he had them documented. So there's a way you can find these things. Also, Matamp, who was I believe a Nipmuc leader, Sagamore Sam, Matunas, a great general, Sanku Manchu of the Pocumtucks, and Magunaway of the Abenaki. So these are just a few of the names. And as I said, there are a lot more. And it's pretty fascinating to think that we can actually find these names. Sometimes you can connect deeds, actual acts with these people, but other times they're kind of lost to history. But that's the mystery. Where are the council fires, and who was there, and how do we know? So that's going to be part of the next phase of our study. So one more thing about Northfield before we go to the falls. This is a very busy map, but it's an important one. This came from Lisa Brooks, who wrote an exceptional book on the King Philip's War incidents and history. She's a professor at Amherst College. She wrote a book called Our Beloved Kin. And in that book, I just love the chapter where she talks about the woman sachem, Sunk Squaw Witamu, and her captive, Mary Rowlandson. So in February, Lancaster, over here somewhere, where am I at? I can't really see it. It's here somewhere. Should be right near.
Right next to National.
There you go.
Right there. There we are. Thanks, Rich. So there was an attack on Lancaster, and people were killed. Houses were burned down, destroyed. and captives were taken. One of the most famous captives was Mary Rowlandson. So Mary Rowlandson her husband was away trying to get, convince the Massachusetts Bay authorities to send some reinforcements. And she was taken captive that night on February 10th, and then began what became known as her removes. In other words, the different locations that she was at during her 3-month captivity. So you can see these little numbers, 2, and then she zigzags all over the place up to Nichawag, which is Petersham, number 4. Getting closer, up here, Pagwag was a native fort on the Millers River, on the Pagwag River. At one point, right in Athol, what is modern day Athol, they were being, the group of, let's say, raiders were being chased by the English, and they were heading up or down the Millers River, down the Pagwag River towards the mouth. And the natives fashioned a number of rafts to get across the river and escaped. So several hundred natives, elderly, women, children, warriors, got across the river, and the English didn't cross the river. They stopped there, and the raiding group left and headed up to where they were coming here. They're coming to Northfield. So they went up on the way to Northfield, number 7. So Mary Rowlandson, when she was redeemed back in Princeton, Mass, for $20, 20 pounds rather, when she was free after 3 months, eventually wrote she wrote about her captivity. And it was one of the rare, let's say, captive narratives where she was actually in the middle of this band under the control of Weetamoo, and she wrote about her removes and her travels and travails. So interestingly, that book I mentioned, Our Beloved Kin, by Lisa Brooks, does a fantastic study, almost in gender studies, between Mary, who was an English woman, and basically Weetamoo, who was a woman leader. And the roles, as Lisa Brooks says, were completely reversed, so that the Wampanoag Sunksqua, Weetamoo, and the English mistress read each other through culturally specific frameworks. The roles were reversed. So the native woman became the household mistress, and the English mistress became a servant. And their interaction was absolutely fascinating to read about. The book is dense. I mean, you're not going to just sit down and read it in one fell swoop, but that particular chapter, I believe it's called The Captive's Lament, just fascinating, because the cultural comparison is just great. So that was basically Mary Rowlandson. And she wrote in her book, she said, "I went along that day mourning and lamenting, leaving farther my own country and traveling further into the vast and howling wilderness." So that kind of typifies what she was going to be like for the next 3 months, which is, Weetamoo had to put up with a lot. So we came that day to a great swamp, by the side of which we took our lodging for the night. When we came to the brow of the hill, I thought we had come to a great Indian town. The Indians were as thick as the trees, seemed as if there had been 1,000 hatches echoing at once. You're talking about Northfield here. And as on her 7th remove, so she's coming up basically through Irving on the edge of Warwick and going along the back path under Craig Mountain and showing up in this wide space in the southern part of town here. She, on her seventh remove, she said the swamp by which we lay was as it were a deep dungeon and an exceeding high and steep hill before it. I saw a place where English cattle had been. Quickly after that we came to an English path, which so took me that I thought I could there have freely laid down and died. So she was so homesick, and like I said, she was a handful the whole trip because she, you know, they were on starvation rations, and this relatively haughty English woman, who was nevertheless the property of her husband, really, she was just dying for any kind of morsel. She was even offered a piece of horse liver that had been hanging around a while. She just gobbled it down. So everybody was starving, and that's one thing that she didn't understand, is that whatever there was, they shared. And she grabbed the piece one time, and we had to take it away from her because it was not hers to claim all for herself. She had an interesting stay, though, so I'd recommend checking that out. There's about a 20-page book that she had written, and it was published about the 1680s. So, anyway, yeah, I'm going to just I'm going to move the next slide, and I'm going to take a break. And Joe, go ahead.
One interesting aspect to Mary Rowlandson's writing, and David had just explained how the things were reversed, but Mary Rowlandson was the first woman of European descent to have been published in the New World, in the United States. So she was the first, and she was talking about her life. She was talking about what she experienced, but history has a way of booting you into the spotlight centuries after you're gone, and we know what a lot of us who grew up in the 60s were trying to get straightened out relative to what indigenous people had understood for thousands and thousands of years, which is how important women are in society, and what a profound part they play, in particular with indigenous women, because they were the ones that chose the leaders. They watched them grow up as little children, and they chose the leaders. And here's Mary Rowlandson. She's a captive, and she lost her child on that trip, and she thought all was lost, and she never got to know that she was the first woman of European descent to have been published in the United States. So it's pretty profound, I think.
Thank you. Everybody okay? I'm just going to go into the second part, probably a little bit shorter than the first part, but y'all hanging in there okay? Yeah? Okay, that's good. All right, so this is like fast forwarding, but not fast forwarding, because we all participate in a project of looking into what happened at the massacre. So I talked about the bookends of the war here in the valley. So Richard Beers in a lot of ways, as well as Mr. Beers also, or Captain Beers also being part of the Hopewell Massacre scene, ambush, and also Lathrop, who was part of the Bloody Brook episode that happened after that. So what I'm going to talk about here is quickly what involved in modern times our delving deep into the history of the massacre at the other bookend, at the other end of the war in the valley. So we had a couple of things going on. I'll keep it moving along, but on this place, where are we at? Wissatinawag. So that is basically what we all know, or down that part of the valley, as Canada Hill. It's the ridgeline that overlooks Turner's Falls and overlooks the falls. So that got conflated with Peskiomscut. Peskiomscut being the accepted name at this point for the falls at Turner's Falls, or what we call Peskiomscut Falls, and later was called Turner. But anyway, a couple of things are going on. One is that Walmart wanted to build a plaza on the hill up there at Canada Hill. And it belonged to the Mackin family, who had been doing sand and gravel operations since the 50s. And what do you know, along came a federal law called the National Graves Protection, I'm getting the letters wrong, but it's a Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, 1990. So Mackin couldn't be digging out human bodies anymore, which he had been doing since the 60s. And we got a whole lot of documentation about that. A wonderful man, citizen, stepped up from Northfield, George Nelson. I don't know if you know George or knew of him. Anyway, he was watching what was going on and felt it was really wrong, but he didn't, what could he do about it? So eventually, by the year 2004, he signed an affidavit stating exactly what he saw. So prior to that, Mackins, they've been pulling out entire skeletons of people. George Nelson said, I saw on piles next to the swamp, I saw human skulls and bones on the piles, and they were going to be bulldozed into this swamp the next morning, which is a regular thing. They sorted out the human remains from the sand that they wanted for construction purposes, and the human bones along with stumps and roots and other stuff got separated and just bulldozed in. So again, that was before the 1990 NAGPRA Act, but anyway. And it was before the Wetlands Protection Act, because they were filling in swamps galore. So anyway, that was in about 1999 to 2000, the Walmart was stopped. Secondly, the town of Montague wanted to bulldoze basically a sand dune from the Montague Plains that contained ceremonial stones. The town didn't buy the fact that it had ceremonial stones, and so the Narragansetts and the Mashpee Wampanoag, under the National Historic Preservation Act, took action and took the whole project down to Washington to the advisory board, and they won their case. So that meant that the ceremonial stones at the Turner Falls Airport were protected. And not only that, the keeper, the Department of the Interior, the keeper of the Registry of Historic Places, determined that those stones at the airport were actually the center of a 16-mile radius that should be considered a ceremonial stone landscape and not violated. So that was a huge victory. So we're moving along. There was, just before that was the reconciliation ceremony between the Narragansetts and the town of Montague. So that was performed. So we had 3 stepping stones going on, and then we were kind of saying, well, what are we going to do next? So Paul Robinson, who was a state archaeologist of Rhode Island, very, very forward-looking person, said, what about applying to study the massacre at the falls and applying to the American Battlefield Protection Program? So we did, got shot down in 2013, and the feedback was, well, you don't have enough Indian tribes represented because only the Narragansetts got involved. So I was a retired teacher, didn't have anything else to do. So I said, okay, I volunteered to be the coordinator. And I could, because everybody else was on a salary in the town hall, and they didn't have time to do this. So I wrote to every single tribe in Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut to get their support to bolster our application the next time around. then we'd had tribes, plenty of tribes. So we got about 7 or 8 tribes wrote a letter of support. And I figured out that the state archaeologist was also the head of all the Massachusetts historic commissions. So I got people from Northfield Historic Commission, Montague, Gill, Greenfield, and Deerfield, the historic commissioners, to write a letter of support too. So how is that Massachusetts historic commissioner going to turn a deaf ear to all of the 5 towns who want this? And so we had a great lineup of 5 historic commissioners and 7 or 8 tribes saying, we think this study should happen. So it did. So we got the money, and we haven't looked back. We are in our 10th year now, and we've gotten about $250,000 from the feds to continue doing this kind of work. So what we did is we got the money, we just formed an advisory board of the commissioners and the tribes, and then our next task was to hire an archaeologist. We wound up hiring Kevin McBride, who was working for the Pequot Museum at the time, and then the University of Connecticut. So we are in the process of doing another round of procuring a principal investigator to do more work this summer. So the long and short of it is, we've been meeting every first Wednesday of the month for 10 years, except for during COVID, with 5 commissioners and 4 Indian tribes, and just going over. And I tell you, some of the information, it's kind of interesting because the native monitors are out in the field with the archaeologists looking over the shoulder, so when something turns up, you've got 2 different cultural perspectives on it. And there's been some really fascinating discussions, especially back at the advisory board. And so we have the archaeologists, we have the 5 non-tribal people and the 4 tribal people, and this is a way of reconciliation too, because the beauty of it is that we're talking about this topic over here, and here we are, culturally different people, looking at it together. It's not like, okay, let's get together and have a truth and reconciliation thing. It's more like, let's work on this project together and then learn something, and that's been what's going on. So some of those commissioners had never talked to a real Indian before, to coin a phrase, and it was really illuminating for people. And the Nipmuc visitor, not visitor, but the Nipmuc Tribal Historic Preservation Officer was a dear friend of ours. Oftentimes when we sat down, he says, I'm just feeling so thankful that you're having me sit at the same table. I say, what? But that was how they felt, like they weren't welcome and in their own land. And so the money from that particular grant, we made sure that a good chunk of it was dedicated to those 4 tribes to tell their own story about what happened. And some of it was heart-wrenching. I'll tell you about that as we get into it. But anyway, so this is what's been going on. And this document is what we came up with. So if you don't know, I'll be quick about this, but down here would be Deerfield, burnt to the ground in May of, having been burnt to the ground a year before. But here is Turner and Holyoke and 138 very upset and angry farmers, just not going to take it anymore. There was an issue, a number of issues. Of course, the young farmers were sick of having their crops burned, their cattle stolen and driven off, their kinfolk were killed, you name it. A lot of things going on for a young farmer who was just trying to get by. And of course, the native people, they were dealing with the same thing. So there was a flashpoint, and Captain Turner, who happened to be, this is something that many people who had thought about this and studied it, but a lot of us didn't know, is that because he was a 63-year-old Baptist. And so he was let out of prison in Boston, Puritan Boston. You couldn't be a Baptist in Boston. And he was let out of prison to come out here and kill Indians. He had a little bit of military training, apparently. His trade was a tailor. Somehow, one of the stories is that he would form a contingent of Baptists to go out and fight in the valley here. Be that as it may, he was assigned to the garrison, and he moved around, but he was in Northampton one of the times when the natives attacked Northampton and were repulsed. So this contingent of 138 farmers and a couple of professional soldiers, along with William Turner, charged out of Northampton and Hatfield. Came through Hatfield, came through burned down Deerfield, crossed the ford here, followed the Green River up to Cherry Rum Brook, which still exists as a place name if you know Greenfield at all, and then headed this way, got into the vicinity of Stop and Shop where the White Ash Swamp is, and then went to Factory Hollow, and at the top of the west bank of Factory Hollow of the Fall River, tied the horses up, and then went down the slope, up the other side, and then essentially where they were aiming for this place. And so essentially they waited for dawn, swept down on that refugee village, which was not a soldier's camp, but a non-combatants camp. Elderly women and children came down, attacked. Again, I'm going through this real fast because it was incredibly awful, incredibly dramatic for both sides. And the attacked this spot in Riverside now, and then the story goes that some of them, including young Jonathan Wells, about 16 years old, lingered a little bit too long at the camp, giving the soldiers from the coalition forces of natives the time to cross over and to counterattack. So a lot of the counterattack was not really developed and studied too much by the historians at the time, because approximately 300 people died there who were natives, and some of them were shot, some of them were put to death by the sword, some of them jumped into the river and were carried over the falls. But be that as it may, there were about 300 people died, give or take. The people lingered a little bit too long, giving time for the soldiers in Unity Park, on the islands, upriver near the mouth of the Pagwag, near the Millers River, to hear the gunshots and then start coming down. And so because these were young farmers, first of all, they were outgunned because they had hunting rifles mainly, and the natives had state-of-the-art, for those days, weapons. They would have gotten them from the French, they would have gotten them from the Dutch, possibly picked up on the battlefield. They repaired things like that themselves. Also bows and arrows, of course, but the primary thing would have been musket balls that they were using. They skedaddled over here, right about where Kosmeskis Bus Company is now. They went down the east bank and up the west bank to where the horses were tied up. And then they started fleeing. They panicked. These were not soldiers. These were young farmers who clearly were out of their depth because native men trained as warriors, as fighters from their very young age. And the native people here knew the terrain. Nobody except two guides had ever been north of Deerfield, I'm told anyway. So what the English had to do was to go back exactly the way they came, because that's the only way they knew. So the way they came in, they went out, and the natives knew. And so, knowing the terrain, they hung out, waiting for the English to show up, and they ambushed them, and then headed across country and waited for the next meander and ambushed more. One of the major sites, if you know Greenfield at all, there's the Four Corners area where Cherry Run Brook is. There's the elementary school, Four Corners School. Some of the artifacts that were found, that was one of the heaviest places. They found 60 or 70 musket balls on the playground there from that engagement in May of 1676. So I'll get to that part in a very short amount of time. They headed down here. They came to the Greenfield swimming pool and the ford right there, and that's where Turner was shot. And the rest, by then people were panicked. They were trying to get home the best way they could. The forces split up. Some were following Holyoke, some were following Turner, some were just off on their own. I think Jonathan Wells at 16 just headed out on his own and had all kinds of misadventures, but eventually got back. Got down through here, and right at the ford again was a good chance for the natives to pick off more people retreating because of the narrowness of the path down to the river. So I'm going really fast, but that's the general scope of what we have learned. And if you can picture that, then you can see this is where Turner's Falls is. This is where Canada Hill is. Gill is up this way. Riverside is there. And the Greenfield swimming pool and Route 91 goes through this way here. Cheapside and the North Meadows. Okay? So, Misha? How am I doing for time? Is it okay? Or getting close to? Yeah, okay. All right, so this is actually a summary, and it's self-explanatory. I don't know if you can see it from the back, but new light on May 19th. Phase 2 archaeological findings by the University of Connecticut research team. These are the people involved. Kevin McBride, David Nomick, Ashley Bissonette, and a lot of volunteers were out in the field with people because what we used were metal detectors. So the Park Service is interested in battlefield artifacts. They're not interested in arrowheads, they're not interested in pottery, they're not interested in human remains, although if human remains had been found, that would have shut down everything for quite a while because there's incredible legal protocols. But we didn't come up with any human remains on this trip. So the battlefield study was kind of unusual because it wasn't like the Battle of Little Bighorn or the Concord and Lexington fight. This was stretched out over 7 miles in a long route. So we felt pretty good that after 2 summers, we had actually done 3 miles of the 6.5 mile stretch. And it led all the way from basically Riverside, right near Wagon Wheel Restaurant, all the way along past Stop and Shop, down Silver Street, and almost to the Greenfield swimming pool. So we've got another 3 miles to do because they had to jump. They're running out of money and time, so they were skipping ahead to likely spots. There were 7 native villages, not just the one. There was the settlement at Peskiomskut. There was a small fort at Wissatinawag on Canada Hill. There was a soldiers' camp at Unity Park. There was another at Cheapside. There were a couple on the 2 islands. If you can see them when you cross the General Pierce Bridge, now that it's open, you can look up and see beyond the one that's first visible. There's another island or 2 up that way. The Deerfield Meadows, there was a contingent there, and the mouth of the Millers River, there was another site. So a lot of villages, and I guess the going story was 3 captives got out of the Peskiomskut camp and got down to tell Turner that this is going to be a piece of cake because there's only one village, there's only one site there, and it is populated by the elderly and a couple of soldiers, so no big deal. So that part of gleaning the data and the records in the archives showed that there were a lot more camps than generally you would have thought. New defining features. So this was David Nomick's specialty. He was a military terrain analyst, and so he checked out the whole lay of the land and where the likely choke points would have been, where the ambushes were, what were the obstacles to, for example, the line of sight, and how could people have hidden themselves, the natives especially. So in a lot of the, what would I call it, the recounting by the white historians of the 1680s and 90s, they didn't have this capacity to go walking around on the land and checking it out using GPS, etc. So this was new information as to where some of the ambushes could have been. One of the interesting things, swales, is that if you can picture the fleeing colonials coming to the east bank of the Fall River, going down, crossing, and going up the other side. Well, lo and behold, on the west side in that bank, the team with their metal detectors got all of these musket balls embedded in the bank, because as the colonials were scrambling, natives were shooting at their tail feathers, and a lot of these musket balls were going whack into the bank. And then when they got up to the top, they had evidence of the fact, just like in some John Wayne movies where they were hiding behind the dead horses and shooting. And then some of the horses, of course, were totally capable of streaking across towards the swamp and getting away. So they did all of these musket ball analyses and distance, you just name it. It was just a fascinating study. So we're learning all this stuff. Recovery of battle-related objects. 548 lead musket balls so far from that day. It was just fascinating. Here it is, 300 plus years later, and yeah, there's still, we're just waiting for people to find them. And all of these, and in this book here, the Battlefield Study Technical Report, they have, dozens of pages of pictures of individual musket balls that have been analyzed, and they could tell you, what kind of rifle they came from. Was there a defect in the barrel that caused this certain defect in the musket ball? All kinds of stuff. And one of the big things that we're wondering about is where the lead came from. So that's kind of what they're thinking about now. Did it come from a native lead mine? Did it come from an English source or a French source or a Dutch source? So we really pushed hard on the native strategies and tactics, because that hadn't always been studied. So a couple of things that turned up. What was Philip's role? Well, Philip was actually not in the war so much. He was not on the battlefield, put it that way. He was out taking care of planning. He was a diplomat going up to try to negotiate with the Mohawks, and that didn't turn out too well. He provided material support, such as supplies and ammunitions, etc. He was not a field or a military commander for the most part, although they called it his war, I guess, because he was kind of the figurehead of the war. A lot of people have said, well, these men should have called it Kenosha's War, or Matuna's War, or Quaipan, or Weetamu's War, or Monaco, because they were in the field all the time for almost 2 years, and they were doing all the fighting. And so that was an interesting twist. Just like finding out a little bit about William Turner's biography, finding out a little bit more about Philip's role was pretty fascinating for a lot of us. Coalition forces of men and women from several different tribes. So these are not all the Nipmucs in one group led by a Nipmuc leader, and all the Narragansetts in a different group led by a Narragansett leader. It was an international force, literally a coalition. And people from all different tribes were mixed in these attacks. So that was an interesting twist. And of course, they had a superior knowledge of the terrain. I mean, they had, this was their homeland. They knew this place, the hills and the trees talked to them, the stones. So they knew where they were, whereas the English They could have been on Mars or the moon because they just didn't know. Plus, they had a lot of fear about this unknown and the wilderness, like Mary Rowlandson was saying. So that cost them dearly because they didn't know how to get home except following the way they came in. And I love this part. And my hat's off to Peter, Thomas, Stephen Williams' notebooks. I'm going to paraphrase, and hopefully during the Q&A, if anybody is still capable of asking questions, we can get into that. But correct me if I'm wrong. So Stephen Williams, if you grew up here, you read The Boy Captive of Old Deerfield, right? Yeah, and it's not so much. Okay, well, I did, and I can still remember on WHI John Hygus reading the chapters of The Boy Captive of Old Deerfield. This was before television almost, but anyway, that book was written in 1950 as a kind of a fiction adventure for boys and I suppose girls at the time. Who knows? But Stephen Williams was redeemed. He came back after being captured in 1704. And I believe he became a preacher just like his father, John Williams, who was one of the first. He was also captured and returned and redeemed. So later in his life, Stephen took it upon himself to go out and interview some of the soldiers who were there at the fight. Wow. And so, as Peter had pointed out, here you have a first-hand account of what happened. Didn't get filtered through what's his name? There was Mather and Hubbard and Gookin and all those guys. This came from Stephen Williams, who wrote down what he heard, and apparently he interviewed some of the native combatants also. So what do you know? All this notebook was taken care of and it disappeared, and then around 2010 or earlier, 2006, when PVMA acquired it. Somewhere recently, anyway. And PVMA, the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association, got their hands on it. Problem was that it was written in the late 1700s, early 1723. And with that handwriting, which is, hard, F's look like S's and all that stuff. So Peter transcribed the whole thing, and hats off to Peter, because that gave our archaeologists incredible insights as to what happened that day, how many people died, exactly, things like that. So that particular set of interviews is now transcribed into modern day English. So that is another thing that was really incredibly important. Okay, so, and I'm going to end with this because I think it's ironic. So, King Philip's War, this horrific massacre at the falls in what was called Peskionscut, sometime around 1850, 60, somebody felt it would be a good idea to call those falls Turner's Falls, because of course he died in that, but kind of overlooked the fact that he led an incredible genocidal massacre of people there. But there are many sides to the story, so anyway. But when Crocker came to town and laid out Turner's Falls with avenues and streets and industrial development, he carried on the suggestion that it should be called Turner's Falls. So that's the story about that. However, that was 1676. What do you know? That wasn't the end. Native people resisted all the way down to the Treaty of Paris, almost 100 years after the founding of Deerfield. And so you had King William's War, Queen Anne's War, 1702, 1713. The raid on Deerfield, the celebrated raid, was 1704. A lot of the Pocumtuck who were driven out came back and got their revenge. But that wasn't all. Then Greylock's War. He raided Northfield. He was Dummer's War, Brattleboro. He was out in the country coming down from Missisquoi and all through this area. He was from Westfield. He was a Waranoco and blended in well with the Abenaki. So I'm just saying that all of these successive wars by Indian people trying to reclaim their homelands or defend their homelands. And it went on and on and on. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 63, ended with the Treaty of Paris, but also ended in 1759 when the celebrated Battle of the Plains of Abraham took place, and the English sailed around the back of Quebec City and came up, scaled up the cliffs and took Quebec by that maneuver, and that was basically the end at that stage. And then there was a lot of like peace treaties that are going to take years to get it settled, but by 1763 that basically ended the New England Wars. However, when the French left, they left a vacuum, especially in the Ohio River Valley, and Chief Pontiac, I don't say he took advantage of that, but he definitely it's his time. He was a leader from the Ohio River Valley, and he rose up against the English. And he beat, or at least he fought, Lord Jeffrey Amherst's forces to a standstill. And that was kind of embarrassing. And Amherst was called back to England, where he lived out his retirement as a country gentleman. But in the meantime, Pontiac had written his name. And that, Colin Calloway from Dartmouth College wrote a great book called The Stroke of a Pen, 1765, so you count 10 years ahead and you've got the American Revolution. So you can see what's going on. And Pontiac's war and the defeat of the French kind of contributed to that rising revolutionary fervor, because the English forbade the American colonists from crossing the Appalachians. They're not supposed to go into that territory. And the American colonists said, no way, I'm going to go. And that led to one of the issues. And then, of course, they're getting kind of rambunctious. And so the English stationed troops in Boston and those areas and made the colonists put the redcoats up. So that contributed to a growing, and of course, the tea business. And you all know the American Revolution story. But I just wanted to point out that this long, long, long list of native people trying to liberate their homelands and fight back. Greylock, that was a huge, they never did catch up with Greylock. He avoided capture. His descendants are still out there somewhere. He hung out up near Missisquoi, and he just never was caught. As a matter of fact, his name refers to something like "he who tricks everyone," or something to that extent. So, yep. So anyway, I talked myself totally out, and thank you for being so patient and hearing this story. And I'll just stop here. And if you still have any stamina, you could certainly stick around and ask some questions. Okay? Thank you. Thank you. When the attack occurred at Pesquiomscut, and the story is that people were fleeing across what is now Barton Cove. In those days it was a meadow, and they were fleeing across that meadowland, Barton's Cove, and heading upriver. Who were they? Were they soldiers? Were they women and children? I don't know personally. Don't know. Peter, who is Peter Thomas, says don't know. I would take a wild guess in assuming that it was could have been anybody. There were not many soldiers. Yeah, there were not many native soldiers in the camp, and we don't know how effective they were. So who knows who fled across there. But it's a good observation because that was also a direction in which people went. So that's all I know, Matt.
In Greenfield. Whoops, better stop talking. Sorry.
Sometimes to books with files and transcriptions. Are those published and available?
Yeah. The question was, we were talking about these technical reports with all the information and the pictures of the musket balls and the maps and all that. Is that available? It's available on the website. There were hard copies made for the members of the board, but the last one, most recent, is the 2020 version, which is the picture that I showed up here. And that one is the definitive one right now. And there's an incredible description of the war context, but also all of those musket balls and analyses. So if you go to the Town of Montague website, then there's a button that you could find. It's either grants or battlefield, one or the other, but you can get all that there. As far as the Stephen Williams notebooks, I don't know what the availability is at.
They're still in, I have copies.
Yeah, so it's not been published. In the 2020 version of this, there are numerous quotes, though, from the Williams notebook, so you could see a good representation. But I'd recommend that because otherwise, it's each of these is 280 pages long, so it hasn't been published. I think one of the big projects will be to take that information and make it accessible and readable, because this is pretty dense stuff and it's organized to meet the National Park Service requirements. But if it were what did you call that, Joe? What's what's your
Primary documents.
Primary documents.
Yeah.
If we could do it like an executive summary or an interesting book about that, we'd do that. That's in the works. Not even in the works, it's in our minds.
As a local resident, one of the things you did mention in talking about King Philip's War was King Philip's Hill, which we all hear about and see the documentation of. Did that have much significance?
That's a good question. I was just looking into that this afternoon, and Sheldon kind of says, I don't think it was King Philip's Hill. But I don't know. Peter, do you have an idea? Was that legit? I know that Dina Dinko's did some studies there.
There's nothing that tracks a specific location that Philip was located in here. I mean, the camps are around. Not a Turk and talking to you. The camps. The major camps are just below Vernon Falls. The whole where the river comes down is the power plant and the falls, and it takes a big bend, and then it comes down on the ashore. And that whole plain up there was just camps, all the way down. I suspect down into here as well. But if you figure there's 3,000 to 4,000 Narragansetts out here, let alone all the other communities that are trying to escape and get beyond where the English can reach. It's very populous. Now, Philip, initially, he's not here. In the fall, he goes to New York. He's trying to persuade the Mohawk to join him. Now, if you were here with the talk that I was giving, you know that the Mohawk and Macomb weren't too happy with one another. And why he ever went to New York to get the Mohawk on his side, I will never know. Particularly since he took Sacramento with him, who was a rallying leader and would have been not too friendly with the Mohawk either. So there were a couple of thousand Indians from Canada that came down. The French would have been on their side. They did not actively participate, but they were supplying guns and powder and stuff. That supposedly came down to join Philip in New York, and Mohawk sent them away to fight. So then Philip comes back here in the wintertime and is joined with the other parties that David was talking about in council. Whether the council was where the council parties were, or whether they were in the settlement, with Mary Rowlandson. She doesn't, I don't think she actually talks about the council, but there was one, clearly there was one here. And what we find in the spring is that they apparently arranged that part of the native population of fighters were going to go east and start attacking the eastern towns again. And others would be left here in the valley. So Massacre, who's Cananchit's uncle and advisor, stays here for the Narragansetts. And Cananchit goes east and eventually gets caught and killed. But they clearly had a strategy. And I think they were looking at the valley as a place to potentially retreat if they really couldn't go home. They really wanted to go home. Philip goes home with Mary Rowlandson. They travel back from here east together. And then, I mean, there's a long story involved, but there's not, in Mary Rowlandson's tale or any other document I've ever seen that pinpoints, oh, Philip was here or anybody else was anywhere specific. It's all made up in terms of later on from whatever people account they had. And I think it turned into just one thing. The books are written by Temple and Sheldon. And Temple's a much better historian than Sheldon is. And probably it was Temple that actually came up with all those Indian names rather than Sheldon. I don't think Sheldon could have given them. So anyway,
thank you. So the mystery remains about the King Philip's Fort Hill. There was an archaeologist celebrated in this vicinity called Dina Ding Kos, and apparently she did some studies up there. Somewhere there might be some information from her studies, but for the time being, it hasn't been disproved. So, yeah, Becky, you have the mic.
Thank you. My question is, I think you said that in the beginning that this presentation will be available. Will the maps and the presentation that you put on the screen also be as visual uses also on that same site?
Yes, they'll be embedded in the video. So, yeah, so
It
you'll
looks like
see David
excellent
talking
resources.
and see the slideshow together.
And there's excellent resources for schools.
It'll be posted both on northfieldpubliclibrary.org on the library's website, and then also at northfield350.org. That website will eventually go away when we're done with this year, but it'll be on the library's website.
Will you put it on northfield.org?
Well,
Yes, we can pass it. It'll really be on VNCTV's YouTube page, so any of us can link to it. So Delegate could link to it as well.
I'd like to real quick on King Philip's Hill, seeing I look at it every morning when I eat my oatmeal. You have to have an understanding that when you have 3,000 refugees who have been compromised via starvation, lack of resources, and such losses as they've occurred, that they would have been put in a safe place. Now, understanding that for the most part, the enemy would have been coming from the south up the river. So King Philip's Hill, as the sign indicates, would have been a prime area for the lookouts to be able to safeguard the refugees that were just a few miles further north. So it's not so much that Philip sat on the hill and ate hot dogs or anything. He didn't. And they named the hill after him because they named the war after him. But if you talk to most indigenous people, they don't call it King Philip's War. They call it the Second Puritan War of Conquest for them it's very important that maybe there's another way to talk about this war. But King Philip's Hill, I do believe, because I've walked the terrain and I've lived here right in that area for over 35 years, was strategically located. And if you need to understand about these immense yellow pines, these white pines that are growing up and down the Connecticut River, they were such a profound natural resource that the King of England decided that he could rebuild his navy after he lost a great deal of his navy in a tsunami. He could rebuild his navy with these incredible white pines because they created these phenomenal masts. They were just straight as an arrow, strong and very tall. That hill was covered with these white pines. And if any of you have ever grown up as a kid around a white pine, you can climb to the top of these suckers just like a ladder. The branches just go clook, 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 take you right up to the top. Well, these white pines are positioned on King Philip's Hill in a fashion that if they had scouts on top of those pines that was at the bend in the river, they could see south and they could see north. They knew what their people were doing in the north and they could see who was ever coming from the south. But it doesn't necessarily mean that King Philip sat up there or had a witu there or even had any kind of council there. But I can guarantee you he had young braves there climbing those white pines.
The wood engraved face, I think it was that part of the report that you showed.
Oh, the war time. Yeah, that was discovered at the site. Do you want to talk about that? You know about it? Okay. Yes, it was recovered at the site, made its way eventually to Amherst College. It was some of these young English fighters were looting the hell out of the place. People seem to think that this was a long, drawn-out battle, but it's my sense that 4:45 in the morning, when the signal was given and they cut loose with those muskets in those witus and wigwams, all hell broke loose. These refugees were not prepared to fight for themselves within the first 20 minutes or 40 minutes of that onslaught, and that's when I judge most of them ended up dying. But so they came in. They didn't get any. The English came in. They didn't get any resistance per se for a number of minutes while the resounding sound of the muskets made its way upriver and down on the islands. And then the indigenous young braves started to come and be able to try to defend the people that were there. But there were a lot of goods that were laying around, and a lot of these young soldiers started to grab what they could find in the wigwams and on the ground. And that particular war tomahawk, it's a club, it's a war club, was on the ground and picked up, and theoretically was something that was taken back by one of the soldiers from that attack on May 19th. And it ended up eventually in Amherst College Museum. And then somehow or another it was supposed to have been preserved forever, and it ended up on the internet for sale. So, we've got some real challenges out there with how the antiquities are supposed to have been taken care of. But you were asking about it. It is very unique, and there is more to it than what you see in the picture. And apparently in the carvings there's a story. And I don't know exactly what the story is, but I can guarantee it was not just something off the top of somebody's head. It meant something to someone. Maybe clan stories or stories of how it got handed down. I don't know.
Misha over here.
Part of a war club?
That is a war club, yes. Part of it. Yeah. It's big. It's heavy loaded on one end. Two-handed war club.
Burial sites for those?
From a knot ball usually.
And also, perhaps what the... What's that? It's on. You just got to look a little closer. Okay. Could you please speak to the burial sites, if you know them, for those who perished at the falls, and also what the burial traditions may have been at that time?
The ones I started talking about?
The ones at...
in the sandbank at Rowlandson?
The 300 that perished at the... the falls? So I guess, yeah.
Okay. So the question was
about on Canada Hill. I talked about their sand and gravel operations, removing human remains. Okay, so there was at the top of the ridgeline, there was a settlement of native people. There was a village up there, and in the near vicinity of the basalt ridge that goes literally from the edge of Factory Hollow all the way to Poet's Seat Tower and Sacham's Head and all that. So the earlier glaciation and the bed of the Connecticut River, all of this, and Lake Hitchcock, all this contributed to a pretty sizable section of fine sands that were laid down on the Greenfield side, on the west side of that ridge line, and extended all the way out towards what we now know as Stop and Shop. Okay, that whole area. And it makes sense that the villages that were spread all along that ridge line from Factory Hollow to Poet's Seat Tower and Sacham's Head, those were village sites, but they could not bury people on that ridge. So the sand deposits were just perfect for burials, and that's the case that was right at Wensatinnawag, is that hundreds of human remains, hundreds of burials are still there. And however, prior to being stopped, of course, in the 1990s by the federal law, the sand and gravel operation, people were constantly digging into that sand plain to get the sands out, and by the way, they also dug out human remains. And so I was just using one of, I mentioned George Nelson from Northfield, who observed this activity, and he noticed one particular day that there was a black stain that was going to be in the way of a bulldozer. And so he took it upon himself to get to that spot and start removing the sand. And he came upon a skeleton, full skeleton, he later found out it was a young woman of about 19 years old, but she was lying on her side. She had one hand on her chest, and I think one hand behind her head or something like that. And typically facing southwest. Graves. Most native people believed in the southwest as being where the Creator's garden is, Kantautuit. And so he removed that skeleton, and he said as he was taking her out of that grave, the black sand that was clearly probably residual flesh fell away, and so he had this entire skeleton. And he gave it to the University of Massachusetts, and they determined that it was a young woman of about 19, and the quote was very, very, very old. So Peter, as a professional anthropologist, might be able to talk about burial customs. I know enough about some of the burial grounds and where my tribal group comes from in Lyme, Connecticut, right on, it's called the village of Niantic, right on Crescent Beach, and there's a burial ground there, and I know that there's some work that had been done in the 80s because it was, matter of fact, Kevin McBride was responsible for doing the work. They were laying some sewer lines down there. And the anthropologist who works with our community, John Pfeiffer, described some of what he thought were their beliefs. One was having a mirror in the burial area, and typically either seated, most likely seated and facing the southwest. And then the spiritual beliefs behind that, one of the things that archaeologists can't find out is what were people thinking. And so, you find the hard archaeological, the artifacts, but you can't really get to without an informant who knows the tribal beliefs. But that's what I have in terms of information. I know that the group that Joe and I are part of, but especially when those days when they were fighting the Walmart project and dealing with Mackins, that the burials, the human remains that were being dumped in White Ash Swamp, that was stopped. And the organizers of the Friends of Wissatinawag had the law on their side, and they forced the, let's say, it's hardly repatriation, but they forced a lot of the debris and materials to be brought back. So our organization bought that whole 40 acres, and it's now protected in perpetuity. But there are conical mounds where the payloader unloaded all of the debris with bits of bone and burial goods and all that in there. So the story is that we would have wanted the tribal historic preservation officers to come to take care of those reburials, but of course it's a mammoth task going through a 15-foot high cone of earth to get bone fragments, and so we just have determined that that would be the reburial, that would be the cemetery. So beyond that, I think your really key question is, what were the burial beliefs? And so that's as far as I can go with that.
Perseus meteor showers. The Perseus meteor showers address some of that with the ceremonial hill.
Yeah.
So in August 12th through August 17th, you have the Perseus meteor showers. It was believed that if you wanted to know whether your relative, your kin, who had just passed the previous year or so, had made it to Contanawit's house in the southwest, you would go out in a special location on those evenings between August 12th and August 17th, and you'd watch the Perseus meteor showers scoot across the sky to the southwest, and you would recognize the soul of your relative or your ancestor making its way to Contanawit's house. So when you understand that they faced the southwest, it was the beginning of their new journey. And with a little luck, they would become stars that would make their way into Contanawit's house in the southwest. Well, something real quick about the material that came out of the Mackin pit. It ended up becoming the road base for Route 2 in 1964. And in that road base, a lot of those old construction workers saw jawbones and femurs and everything being buried in there. That's the way it was in those days. It doesn't have to be that way anymore, but that's the way it was in those days. Thank you.
Peter might have something to say about that. I like the question about the beliefs and
just quickly in terms of Mackins as well. There were archaeological studies done at Mackins back when this whole upheaval with the Walmart or the store and all. There are occupations along that stretch of the hill that go back 3,000 years. So we're not just talking about communities living on the hill during of war, and these are the skeletal remains. These are the skeletal remains that can have been left behind over those entire time frame of occupations. Mm-hmm. And I did a little bit of archaeological work just in Riverside itself, and right by where the falls would have been, we have a series of occupations that go back to, well, the bottom way you're talking about is 8,650 years ago. So what they were doing is going there every spring to fish. And when you have 8,000 years worth of fish remains that you throw out of the ground, it has an effect. turns the soil coal black. And when you excavated, when we were excavating the site, not very far from where the dam is, there's about that much coal black that's been built up over those times, and it's all full of bone, shad bone, and artifacts. And you've got the entire cultural sequence from what we call early archaic right up through. And a lot of it is kind of later. So that whole area has just been intensively occupied for thousands and thousands of years. And it's just the Turnus Falls Massacre events, just the top of the layer.
Just a quick follow-up. Joe talked about the Perseids, and they traditionally go from the east to the southwest. So in a lot of tribal powwows, you keep the east open. You don't close the circle. So and when there is the grand entry, people come in from the east, and you keep the circle open for the ancestors to get in. And I was up at the Turnus Falls Airport with a couple of tribal officers that one of the nights to see the Perseids, and there was a visitor from the Creek Nation from down south. And the Narragansett Indian tribe, I don't know if Joe knows this story, but the Narragansett Indian tribe office bought us some lounge chairs so we could put them out in the parking lot at the airport and lie back and watch the meteor shower. And this visitor from Florida, the Creek person, on the way to the Narragansett powwow, which always happens during that, we were all there looking, and this beautiful shooting star went over, and he said, "There's my grandmother, I know it." So like Joe was saying, that's a real anecdotal evidence that people, that's a belief with their traveling. The curious part is that I think your question was, do the remains of human beings that were buried, does that tell you anything about their beliefs in the afterworld? So that part is really challenging. But there is a whole lot of spiritual and belief system that does explain a lot. So, other questions? Yes?
How might one volunteer for a dig?
Easy enough. When we have had people out, volunteers out there. So the best thing would be to get in touch with the Nolambika Project. I happen to be one of the officers of that board, but also the coordinator of the archaeology study. So it had come to me somehow. But yeah, we're hoping that will begin happening in late July through September, but it all depends on the bureaucracy down in Washington. Good question, though. Thank you.